Preview. Focus on the main idea. The Egyptians have depended on the Nile River to survive for thousands of years. Places: Egypt, Nile River Valley, Nile River, Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, Memphis. Vocabulary: Delta, Silt, Papyrus, Cataract. The lifeline of the Nile. You are there. You've been chosen to work on an excavation site in Egypt, in northeastern Africa. Your experience in South Carolina sure paid off. Now you're going to a place where early Egyptian civilization began about 7,000 years ago. Flying overhead the Nile River looks like a long, winding snake. The banks of the Nile are lined with palm trees and crops. However, the green quickly disappears into a sea of sand and stones. The desert, or what the ancient Egyptians called the Red Land, covers more than 90% of Egypt. You wonder if you'll make an amazing discovery that will reveal more about life in ancient Egypt. When your airplane lands at the airport in Cairo, modern Egypt's capital city, you prepare for the adventure ahead. Target skill. Summarize. As you read about the geography of ancient Egypt, combine the main ideas. The Nile River Valley. You read in Chapter 1 about how archaeologists have been searching for the first Americans. Then you read about the first civilizations in Southwest Asia. In the 1970s, a skeleton was uncovered in East Africa. Some archaeologists believed it could be 3.5 million years old. They continue to search for more evidence about the first Africans. However, until now, they have found only enough artifacts to piece together the first African civilizations from about 5000 BC. The Nile River Valley was an ideal place for civilizations to thrive in northeastern Africa. Since ancient times, life in Egypt has depended on agriculture. Egypt gets little rain. Surrounded by hot, sandy deserts, the Nile River brought life to the people who lived by it. The Nile is the longest river in the world. It extends more than 4,000 miles in length. Look at the map on the right. The Nile begins in East Africa and flows northward into Egypt. The Nile flows through a delta, a triangular-shaped area of soil at the mouth of a river that looks like fingers spread out. Water flowing northward used to carry silt, a mixture of soil and small rocks, as it surged from south to north into the Mediterranean Sea. Soil was deposited near the mouth of the river. In ancient Egypt, the delta was located in Lower Egypt, which lies to the north of Upper Egypt. In ancient Egypt, the Nile irrigated land that stretched about 5 miles on both sides of the river. This is where Egyptian civilization began and agriculture thrived. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. Review. Why was the Nile River Valley important to the development of civilization in Egypt? Summarize. Giver of life. The Nile overflowed because of heavy rains in East Africa. People living near the Nile, in places such as Memphis, planted seeds after the floods and harvested in late summer. They called this area Black Land because the land was very fertile. Then the cycle began again. The ancient Egyptians sang a hymn or song about the Nile. As the hymn of the Nile goes, when he, the Nile, arises, earth rejoices, and all men are glad. Not far from the banks of the Nile is dry desert land, or what the Egyptians called red land. No crops could grow here. Without the Nile, people would not have been able to grow crops and get water to survive. The hymn of the Nile reveals the importance of the Nile. That givest drink to the desert places which are far from water. Wheat and barley were the most important crops in ancient Egypt. Farmers also grew vegetables. Papyrus was another valuable crop. The Egyptians used its stems to make paper. The paper-making process involved cutting thin strips from the plant's stem and pressing them together. When the pressed strips dried, they produced a smooth surface. Papyrus became widely used for record-keeping. The Nile also was a means of transporting goods. However, the geography of the Nile caused some roadblocks for travelers. 6 cataracts, or waterfalls, break up the flow of the Nile. The cataracts made it impossible to sail directly from the Nile Delta south to East Africa without taking a boat out of the water and carrying it. Because the river flows from south to north, a boat also needed sails to move it upstream. The Nile gave the Egyptians many gifts to help their civilization develop. However, you will read about how the Nile also caused problems for the Egyptians. Review. What made the Nile River an important resource to people living near it? Summarize. Taker of life. Although the Nile did flood regularly, it did not always do so in the same way. Sometimes, heavy rains caused too much water to overflow. Crops would be destroyed, and people lost their lives. Other times, the Nile did not flood enough, and crops could not grow. When this happened, the Egyptians used the food they stored from surplus harvests. The Egyptians needed to investigate why the Nile flooded in a different way from year to year. Like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians built irrigation canals to transport water to their crops. The Egyptians were polytheistic, or believed in many gods, just like the Mesopotamians. They used stories about their gods to explain the natural world, including the Nile. Their main god, Amun-Ra, or Ra, was represented by the sun. The Egyptians observed that over time, the sunrise and sunset changed. They also understood that the moon's appearance changed slightly every evening. The Egyptians then used these observations to make predictions about when the Nile would flood. As you read earlier, they used a calendar to keep track of the number of days between flooding cycles. They determined that the Nile would flood sometime between May and September. The use of irrigation canals and the calendar helped the Egyptians solve their problems with the Nile. Review. Why did the Egyptians consider the Nile a taker of life? Summarize. Summarize the lesson. 3.5 million years ago, humans may have existed in Africa. 7,000 years ago, early civilizations appeared along the Nile River. Lesson 1. Review. Check facts and main ideas. 1. Summarize. On a separate piece of paper, fill in the missing detail below. Sometimes, the Nile flooded too much or not enough. The Egyptians made calendars to keep track of when the Nile would flood. Even though the Nile flooded, it was important to the Egyptians. 2. Describe the route of the Nile River. Use the word delta in your answer. 3. What solutions did the Egyptians come up with to deal with the flooding of the Nile? 4. How was the Nile a giver and taker of life? 5. Critical thinking. Make inferences. Suppose the Egyptians had not tried to predict when the Nile would flood. Do you think their civilization would have lasted very long? Explain your answer. Link to writing. Write a poem. Write 4 to 8 lines about the annual flooding of the Nile. Think about what information you would include in your poem to remind you when the Nile would flood.